Hey folks, so today we're going to talk about three medieval fairy stories. We're going to talk about Marie de France's two lays, Yonec and Lanval, and we're going to talk about the later, probably early 14th century, romance known as Sir Orfeo. I'm also going to give you a little bit of context on belief in fairies and elves in medieval England, much of which comes from Richard Firth Green's recent book, Elf Queens and Holy Friars, Fairy Beliefs in the Medieval Church. Okay, so fairies and elves in the Middle Ages. Well, if I throw out the term fairy today, you might think of Tinkerbell, or a little fluttering thing with wings, or such. And if I throw out the word elf, you might think about the elves from J.R.R. Tolkien's screen versions in Lord of the Rings. The funny thing about both of those versions is that in some ways they're both right for the Middle Ages, except that fairies and elves were kind of the same thing. The terms are extremely fluid. They could refer to little people, like Tinkerbell, big people, like the elves in Tolkien, or they could refer to all sorts of other things that if you are a reader of fantasy, you might see as elves or orcs or various other versions like this. The way that fairies popped up in the Middle Ages was a bit amorphous. They were believed in by many people, probably across Europe. If you think about it today, we most often associate them maybe with Iceland or with Wales, the Celtic parts of Northern Europe, Brittany, and Scotland and Ireland and so forth, maybe Cornwall, that's right on the fringes and associating them with Celtic literature and such. But they were probably believed in by people, or at least entertained by people across Europe for centuries upon centuries. Some of the best evidence that we have for fairy beliefs actually comes somewhat inversely from priests and manuals written for priests telling them what to do if they encountered someone who claimed to believe in fairies. It's helpful to begin with some sort of definition of what a fairy might be in the Middle Ages, and I've already said that it's a bit amorphous. But for the most part, we can think of fairies as creatures who are roughly humanoid. They might look like really beautiful human people, some of the most familiar ways that they're described as kings and queens or noble knights or things like that. Often they glow with light, they have really fancy clothes, they live in palaces, maybe under a lake or inside a hill, in secret and hidden places that can be accessed through some sort of transitional barrier. There are several forests in Europe that are associated with fairy lore, including Fauchelliand in Brittany, and so on and so forth. The places fairies tend to pop up in the ways they tend to be talked about are in what we might see as liminal spaces, places that sort of are in between. We often run into fairies in the Middle Ages at the borders of life and death, at the borders of health and disease, and at physical borders, at the edge of a forest, at a bridge over a stream, at noon time or at dawn or dusk, when one time is shifting to a next time, when one place is sort of becoming another place, but it's not quite there yet. And they often are associated with events like childbirth, with death, with disease. Sometimes fairies are blamed or elves are blamed for making people sick. Sometimes they are images of sort of sexual wish fulfillment or of wealth wish fulfillment. We'll talk about both those versions in the stories that we're going to see in a second. But there is this sort of loosely conceived belief in this sort of extremely gorgeous, very powerful, very strange race that sort of walks on the borders of human life and occasionally interacts with it. Fairies were most noted for either making people sick or sometimes for healing them, for providing them with great wealth. Think of the old leprechaun idea. What do you find at the end of the rainbow but a leprechaun, which is a kind of fairy with lots of wealth that you can get, especially if you know how to find him, if you know the rules. And they're also associated with sort of the paths between life and death. In one medieval romance, Thomas of Ercildoune, actually it's a ballad, excuse me, Thomas of Ercildoune, Thomas has been abducted by the fairy community, and the fairies were also famous for they often abducted people and took them away. Sometimes people would come back and they would either be changed, or time would have passed since they got back, or they would just never return again. People also thought the fairies sometimes would steal human babies and leave a fairy changeling in its place, which would die shortly thereafter. But anyway, when Thomas is abducted by the fairy queen, he goes with her through this strange, sort of shifting landscape, you know, an ocean of blood and darkness and so on and so forth. And he sees 5 paths in front of him at one point, and the queen tells him that one of those paths leads to heaven, another to hell, one to purgatory, one to the earthly paradise, which is the Garden of Eden where Adam and Eve lived, presumably one back to earth, actually, although that's not mentioned as well. And the 5th path that he sees in front of him leads to fairyland, sort of conceiving of it as this sort of separate space, somewhere in the sort of cosmological universe that borders heaven, hell, and earth, somewhere to one side that is accessible if you know the way to get there. When we talk about fairies, this is what we're talking about, this sort of beautiful but liminal people who exist, if you believe in them anyway, on the edges of human life and who interact with it in various ways. Now, of course, you might ask, did people in the Middle Ages really believe in fairies? Did they really think that fairies and elves were going to abduct their children, that they were, you know, the source of great wealth that could be found? And the answer is that, of course, it's impossible to know for sure, but there actually is a lot of evidence that lay people who weren't priests, and even sometimes people who were priests, had, at the very least, a strong potential belief in fairies, that they took them seriously enough that, like in modern Iceland, they might leave a certain tree alone because it was associated with fairies. There's a famous story about roads being rerouted in Iceland just a few years ago because they would have had to cut down a tree known to be associated with the fairies. And so they were real enough to people that there were lots of stories about them, and that some people took them seriously enough to do things, like maybe leave out a bowl of milk or a piece of bread to make sure that the fairies weren't too angry with you or to ask for good luck. The problem people ran into with this sort of seriousness of belief was that it could conflict with Christian beliefs. And there is a long series of sort of changing reactions on the part of the formal priesthood to belief in fairies. At one point, kind of ignoring it, but then as the Middle Ages rolled on, going into the later Middle Ages, the 14th, 15th centuries, and eventually the early modern period, belief in fairies comes to be associated more and more with heretical ideas, like we talked about last week with the belief in magic. Magic wasn't necessarily heretical, but if you associated magic with demons, if you thought that all magic was demonic magic, then magic was by definition heretical, and thus an object of persecution by the church. And fairies were caught up in this debate in the same way as the church tried to formalize and standardize belief. Fairies became more and more a problem. The best way to get into talking about fairies, though, I think, is to step away now from talking about sort of broader beliefs in fairies and persecutions of fairies' beliefs by the church, and just to give you the 3 examples that I promised to give you at the beginning of this little lecture here. So I'm going to talk about 3 different stories. I'm going to start off with the Middle English romance known as Sir Orfeo. Now, if any of you are Greek mythology buffs, you might know the story of Orpheus and Eurydice. In that classical version of the story, Orpheus is married to a beautiful woman, Eurydice. Eurydice either dies or is stolen away by Hades, or Pluto, depending on which mythology you want to use. And he eventually tries to get her back by going to Hades, by going to hell, and playing his harp so beautifully that the king of hell, Pluto, or the god of the underworld, promises that he can have her back. Now, in the original story, there's a problem. Pluto puts a condition, or Hades puts a condition on getting Eurydice back. He tells Orpheus to turn around and to walk back up the long road from his throne to the entrance to hell, and to never look behind him. And if he does look behind him, he will lose his wife forever. And of course what happens is that just before he leaves hell, he's gone the whole way out, he hears a scream behind him, and he's full of doubt as to whether his wife is actually following him, and he turns to look, and he sees her spirit following him as she looks at him sadly. And since he's turned around and violated the promise that he made to Pluto, she vanishes forever. Well, medieval readers of romances didn't seem to like that sort of sad story. And in the Middle English romancer Orfeo, things shift around a little bit. First off, what happens is that Orpheus, is the king of England. He lives in what is sort of modern-day Winchester, according to the narrator of the story, but is known as Thracian, or such a different place then. And he's married to the most beautiful Lady Eurydice, and one day Eurydice goes out with, Herodias actually in the Middle English romance. So she goes out with her ladies, and she falls asleep on a beautiful May afternoon under a grafted tree. Now there are a couple of things here that are particularly notable if you're paying attention to fairies. So first off, at noon, morning is shifting into afternoon. One period of day is becoming the next period of day. Many times noon, just like dawn and dusk, is a special time in fairy stories, and we see fairies showing up then. Also, the kind of tree she falls asleep under in the Middle English is known as an imp tree, which is a grafted tree. It's a tree, if you know anything about like orchards or such, it's a tree where a new shoot has been grafted onto an old trunk, and it's a fairly common practice in fruit growing, but it's also this sort of weirdly liminal space where something old is becoming something new, and two things have been joined together. And when she falls asleep under this tree, and she starts to have a giant fit, actually, sort of throwing her hands up in the air and scratching at her face and going a bit crazy. And her ladies run off, and they get some knights, and the knights come back, and they take her back to her bedchamber. And eventually she wakes up, and she tells everyone that she was dragged off by the king of the fairies, and he told her that she had to come back to that same tree the next day, and he was going to take her away to fairyland. And if she didn't, then he would rip her limb from limb and take her anyway. Well, this terrifies everyone, but Orfeo is determined to protect his wife, and he gets together 1,000 knights, all in their best armor, and they go to the tree. They don't want to violate this compact that the king of the fairies has threatened. They don't want the wife to be torn apart, but they are prepared to defend her. So she sits down under the tree again, and the 1,000 knights and Orfeo himself are prepared to defend her, and she simply vanishes in front of their eyes. The king of the fairies has taken her away, and they can do nothing to stop him. Well, Orfeo then gives up his kingdom. He hands it over to his seneschal, so this sort of right-hand man, his advisor, and he takes his harp and he goes off into the woods to live among the animals and to sleep on the cold moss. And he's out there for 10 years. And as he's out there in the woods, every so often he sees the king of the fairies hunting through the forest with his retinue, and he sees groups of ladies hawking at the river. And one day he walks up to the group of ladies and he recognizes Eurydice there hawking with the rest of them, and they both look at each other very sadly. Well, Orfeo never thought he would really see his wife again. And so when he does see her, he determines that he's going to try and get her back. And so much like the classical myth in which Orpheus went to the underworld, Orfeo follows the group of ladies back to a rock, and they go inside the rock, so into a mountainside or a hillside, and he travels all the way through, And he comes out in Fairyland, which is a place that is sort of beautiful and gorgeous, full of summer and light. And he sees this beautiful palace, flying pennants and things like that, absolutely gorgeous. And he comes up to the palace and he says that he's a minstrel and he would like to play for the king of Fairyland. And they're delighted to see him. They love good music. And they bring him in. And as he passes through, he sees these beautiful fairies. They're glowing with light. They are sort of the perfection of the human form. And then he also sees a bunch of sort of dying or dead or mangled people who are sort of on the cusp between life and death, sort of hanging out in the courtyard, who have apparently been stolen by the fairies. Again, sort of emphasizing this idea of fairyland and the fairies as sort of these liminal creatures associated with these spaces in between one thing and another. And he goes up to the king, he plays his harp, and the king is so impressed by the harp playing that he tells Orfeo that he can have a boon, that he can have whatever gift he requests. Orfeo, of course, asks for Eurydice to follow him back home. And at first the king is disgusted. This dirty, beggar-looking minstrel, he says, would be absolutely an unfit match for the beautiful Eurydice. But Orfeo reminds him that he promised, that he said he could have whatever he asked for. And the king says, well, yes, I have. And so Orfeo leads Eurydice, in this case successfully, back to the forest. And he goes back and eventually he reclaims his kingdom with his queen by his side. And everyone lives happily ever after. So what do we learn then about Fairyland from Sir Orfeo? Well, we see in Sir Orfeo fairies as a parallel to sort of human society. They have kings and princes and knights and castles and beautiful kingdoms, but they are the epitome of that. They are more gorgeous than people are. They live in a land that is always summer. They glow with light, and their land is suffused with light, and light is, of course, associated with heaven and other good things. And even in this sort of description, where they're described as these really beautiful sort of humanoid figures who have all the same desires as regular humans do, to go hunting and hawking and to have beautiful ladies by your side and so forth, they are still associated with this sort of liminal space in between, with the border between life and death, with the border between sort of morning and afternoon and so forth. Okay, so there's one fairy story that gives us this portrait of fairies as liminal creatures. Two more, I'll do these quickly. These are two short lays by Marie de France, one Lanval, the other Yonec. And I want to do them together because they actually parallel each other really nicely. In these stories, we see, among other things, fairies as human wish fulfillment. So in the story of Lanval, Lanval is a young knight in King Arthur's court. He's a foreigner, though, so he's come to King Arthur's court, and he's sort of relying on Arthur's generosity to help him out. And to make a longer story short, that generosity is not as forthcoming as it might be. And so Lanval is broke and penniless and sort of removes himself from court because he can't really associate if he doesn't have any money. And Arthur's forgotten to give him gifts and so on. But he is out sleeping by a river, so again, sort of on the border between the land and the water here now. And he is in. These two beautiful maidens come up and they invite him to come back and see their lady, who is very interested in him. And he goes back with them up along the hillside to this beautiful pavilion, which is so richly decorated with silk and gold that it is the epitome of craftsmanship, something that human hands could not particularly have woven. And in it he finds a half-naked, absolutely gorgeous queen of fairyland known as Lady Triamore, and she gives him basically everything a young knight like him could want. She gives him her body, she gives him gifts, she gives him a purse that is always full of gold whenever he opens it, and she promises him that she will always come to him for whatever he wants, whenever he asks, as long as they are alone, and as long as, and this is the key prohibition here, is as long as he doesn't tell anybody about their relationship. Okay, so what is she? She's wish fulfillment for sex, for money, for fame, so on and so forth. Now, of course, in the story, he violates that promise, and things go amiss because of that. But in the end, she seems to forgive him, and she rides away with him on the back of her horse. And sorry, just getting a bug there. And they are never seen from again. And so in the end, she basically abducts him and takes him back to fairyland with her, which is something that fairies are famous for. So, what is the version of the fairy in this story? Well, this is male fantasy, wish fulfillment, for sex, for money, for fame, so forth. In a very similar but reversed story, we have the story of Yonec, and in this case, a young woman marries a much older, rather sadistic man who keeps her locked up in a tower with no company except for his old sister, who is her sort of prison guard, I suppose, who keeps her locked up there. And she's deeply depressed. She's thinking about killing herself, but one day a hawk flies in through her bedroom window. The hawk transforms into a beautiful young knight, and gives her the companionship and sex and sort of validation that she is not getting otherwise. And there's a whole sort of sequence of events that happen as a result of that. The short version is that she too is supposed to keep the relationship secret, but isn't quite able to do that. The hawk knight dies, but the lady is pregnant. And after she gives birth and she raises her son, she eventually tells her son who his father was, and he goes and he claims his father's sword and his ring, and then he kills the other husband who was so mean to his mother. The mother thus is getting the things that she does not, that she's initially deprived of. And so we have, in this version, the sort of female wish fulfillment. She is locked up, she is abused, and she gets the sex and the companionship and the revenge that she wants, and well, in this case, through her son and through her relationship with the Hawk Knight. Okay, so what does all of this matter? Well, fairy stories were really popular in medieval literature. People enjoyed them just like we might enjoy ghost stories or alien abduction stories or such. Today, these sort of things that might have been unlikely, but people believed in enough to take them somewhat seriously. Some people may have taken very seriously, and they often fall into these categories of sort of liminal metaphors or wish fulfillment or so forth. If we come back to sort of the more political arena and religious arena, with fairies as potentially heretical creatures and the repression of fairy beliefs by the medieval clergy, medieval friars and priests and so on and so forth, we can see fairy beliefs also as a sort of challenge to sort of Christian orthodoxy and to the Christian sort of religious belief system and the medieval church as a whole. And it was a belief system that the medieval church at times, and increasingly so going into the early modern ages, really tried to stamp out, both to standardize sort of Christian belief across Europe, but also to maintain its own power, because fairy belief taken to a far enough extreme can produce a hierarchy that challenges the Christian hierarchy of belief, where the fairies are as powerful and more powerful than Christ or God or so forth, or prayers to the fairies essentially replace prayers to the saints and so on. Okay, so there's a short little lecture on fairies in medieval England. I hope they give you some insight. Take care.